Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're just walking down the street. Maybe you get caught up in some kind of tense moment.
Mm-hmm.
Voices are raised. Maybe there's a protest. Could be anything. Someone shoves you, you shove back. Feels like a pretty standard, heated encounter.
Yeah, happens all the time, unfortunately.
But now imagine the person you just shoved back wasn't just some random person.
Okay.
They were actually an undercover federal officer. Plain clothes, no badge, nothing to tell you who they are.
Right. No visible identification.
Exactly. And suddenly, you're the one facing federal charges. Could be 8 years in prison. Maybe you're denied bond, and the government starts calling you a violent criminal.
All because you reacted to someone you had absolutely no way of knowing was a federal agent?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that hypothetical scenario, that's actually how the article we're digging into today starts its analysis.
It really sets the stage.
It does. So welcome to our deep dive. Today we're looking at a specific bit of U.S. law, Section 111 of Title 18, all through the lens of this one article, which examines a recent, pretty significant case involving a member of Congress.
And what's interesting, or maybe concerning, depending on your view, is how this law, which is meant to protect federal officers, might, according to this source anyway, be applied in ways that really make you question its intent and its impact on regular people.
Totally. So our mission here is to figure out, okay, what does Section 111 actually say? What are the specific concerns this article is raising about how it's being used now?
And crucially, why should you care? Why isn't this just some obscure legal thing?
Right. The article argues it's not hypothetical anymore. This is apparently happening.
Okay, so let's start at the basics. Section 111, what exactly does it outlaw?
Well, it makes it a federal crime to, and this is the legal language, forcibly assault, resist, oppose, impede, intimidate, or interfere with certain federal officials while they're doing their jobs.
So it covers a pretty wide range of actions, not just physical assault. Impede, interfere. That sounds broad.
It is. And the absolute core issue the source jumps on immediately, the thing that really drives its critique, is what we talked about in that opening scenario.
The knowledge part.
Exactly. You do not need to know the person is a federal official to be convicted under this law.
Right. The article really hammers this point home. You could be found guilty for something like, say, putting someone in reasonable fear of harm, maybe just verbally, or even a quick shove, if that person happens to be a plainclothes agent. And your knowledge of their status, totally irrelevant for a conviction.
And just to be clear, this isn't some brand new legal theory, right? The article mentions the Supreme Court dealt with this specific point.
Yeah, over 50 years ago, the court confirmed this interpretation. So the legal precedent is old, but the article's argument is about its current use.
Okay, so that brings us to why the source finds this so troubling today, if you don't need to know who they are.
Then, the article suggests, an undercover agent may be embedded in a protest or at a town hall meeting.
Anywhere public, really.
Anywhere. They could just claim they were impeded or interfered with, and that moment, that interaction...
And suddenly becomes a potential federal crime, even if you were just reacting to what you thought was, I don't know, some random person being aggressive.
And the article takes it a step further. It suggests that under the current administration, this lack of a knowledge requirement isn't just accepted, it might actually be seen as, well, useful.
Useful how?
The source uses some really strong language here, suggesting it feeds into what it calls an appetite for authoritarianism. That's a direct quote.
Wow, appetite for authoritarianism. That's a heavy claim from the source. How do they connect that specific part of the law, the no-knowledge element, to such a big accusation about the administration's motives?
Well, that leads us right into the specific case the article uses to illustrate its point. The situation with Representative LaMonica McIver.
Okay, tell us about that.
So, on May 19th, 2025, federal prosecutors brought charges against her under this very law, Section 111.
A sitting member of Congress.
A sitting member of Congress. The allegation is that she assaulted and impeded officers from ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Okay, when and where did this happen?
It was during a visit she tried to make to an ICE detention facility in Newark. She was apparently trying to conduct oversight, which she's authorized to do as a Congresswoman, but was reportedly denied entry.
And the charge is assault and impeding. The article mentions it's not totally clear what the assault part involved.
That's right. The source notes that the public charging documents don't specify if it was alleged physical contact or something verbal. That detail isn't clear yet.
But the article argues the prosecution itself sends a message.
Exactly. The article's central claim is that this isn't just about this one incident. It contends that using Section 111 against a member of Congress trying to do oversight shows something bigger. That, allegedly, and again, this is the article's argument under the current administration, Section 111 is being, quote, reimagined as a blunt political weapon.
A political weapon. How so?
The source argues the goal isn't really about deterring violence against officers in this context, but instead it's allegedly about trying to silence dissent and criminalize opponents.
Yeah, silencing dissent. That touches on a really fundamental idea, doesn't it? The right to, resist unlawful force, even from the government. That's an old concept.
Oh, absolutely. It's deeply rooted in American legal tradition. The idea that you can resist unlawful force, even from state actors.
Yeah.
The article even brings up Justice Antonin Scalia. It mentions his view that the Bill of Rights was specifically designed to guard against a spirit of oppression and tyranny, and that the Second Amendment, for example, was seen as a check on potential government overreach.
And haven't courts generally recognized self-defense against officers if they use excessive force?
They have, historically. Self-defense, defense of others. Courts have acknowledged those can be valid defenses against unlawful or excessive force by law enforcement.
So you take that right to resist unlawful force, and you combine it with Section 111, where you don't need to know it's an officer.
And you get what the article calls a chilling catch-22.
Explain that catch-22.
Okay, so you could be acting completely lawfully, defending yourself against someone who seems to be attacking you on the street, totally justified self-defense under normal circumstances.
Right.
But if that attacker turns out to be an undercover federal agent, maybe using force unlawfully themselves, you could still face federal charges under Section 111 precisely because you didn't know they were an agent.
So even if you might have a valid self-defense claim eventually.
Right. The article points out that self-defense is something you argue at trial, but getting to trial could take months, even years.
And in the meantime,
the source says, you could be denied bond, stuck in jail, and publicly painted by the government as some kind of violent criminal, all while waiting for your chance to argue you acted lawfully.
And the article says practical things make this even harder now.
Yes, it points to the increased use of masks and plainclothes by federal agents, unmarked vehicles, arrests sometimes made without warrant shown or clear identification given.
Making it harder to know who you're dealing with.
Exactly. Which leads to another really interesting point. The article makes a contrast it draws with impersonators.
Impersonating a federal officer. That's illegal too, right?
It is. It's a federal crime. But the article claims that federal prosecutors haven't really gone after people impersonating ICE officers.
Really? What are these impersonators allegedly doing?
According to the source, they've allegedly used fake badges, fake vehicles, things like that in some communities to, well, improperly remove people, kidnap them, or generally terrorize neighborhoods.
Wow. So the article is saying
it's arguing that in some situations it can be genuinely hard to tell the difference between, quote, a rogue officer and a criminal impersonator.
Yet the law, Section 111,
criminalizes you if you resist someone who turns out to be a real agent, even if you mistook them for an attacker or an impersonator. While the article suggests the actual impersonators might not face the same level of prosecution, it paints a picture of a real discrepancy.
The article then suggests this whole situation, this dynamic, is seen by some as politically useful. What do they mean by that?
Well, the argument presented is that when this law is used, prosecutors or politicians backing them don't need to defend the specifics of the officer's actions or the policy being enforced.
They just say?
They just say we're enforcing the law. It simplifies the narrative, according to the source.
And the article claims this lets other politicians kind of wash their hands of it.
Yes. It mentions a quote from Representative Don Bacon when he was asked about the McIver case. He apparently said something like, "I trust our law enforcement. In the end, we've got judges and juries, appeals." The article interprets that kind of stance as effectively allowing the confrontation itself to become the crime, the arrest to be the main message, and the charge, the Section 111 charge, to become the narrative.
A narrative labeling the person as. What do the articles say?
It uses terms like criminal, vermin, thug, enemy from within, basically framing the target negatively without needing to litigate the underlying issues of the confrontation.
And the McIver case specifically is framed by the source as a warning shot.
Exactly, a warning shot. The article describes Section 111 in this context as, quote, the perfect cudgel, hard to challenge, easy to abuse, and ready-made for headlines.
It's the wrong word.
Very. It even adds, provocatively, that you don't need conspiracy theories when the statute is already written, implying the law itself, as is, enables this kind of alleged use.
Okay, so if that's the problem laid out by the source, what's the proposed fix? Does the article offer a solution?
It does. It argues Congress should step in and amend the law to require that. For a conviction under Section 111, the prosecution must prove the defendant knew, or at least reasonably should have known, that the person they were dealing with was a federal officer performing their duty.
Adding a knowledge requirement, basically. The article sees that as
Not radical, but simply just fair. That's the phrasing used.
And what's the rationale behind that, according to the source?
Well, a few things. First, it would bring Section 111 more in line with basic principles of criminal law. You generally need some level of intent or knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Mens rea.
Makes sense.
Second, it would help prevent federal overreach. It would stop the feds from stepping into situations that the article argues are really state or local matters, like, quote, a shove between two people who perceive each other as private citizens.
So stopping federal courts from handling minor scuffles just because one person happened to be an off-duty or undercover agent.
Pretty much. The source argues that using federal resources on that kind of incident federalizes conduct that doesn't really have a strong federal interest.
And without this change, the article warns.
The warning is pretty stark. It says we could be just, quote, one shove away from turning normal political protest or even legitimate government oversight like Rep. McIver was attempting into a serious federal crime.
And the article is careful to say this isn't just about Representative McIver.
No, it broadens the scope significantly. It argues this impacts potentially any journalist, any activist, any legislator, frankly, any citizen who might find themselves in a position where they feel they need to lawfully defend themselves against what looks like unlawful force.
And the message the government is sending, according to this source,
is blunt. Obey or be made an example. That's how the article characterizes the alleged message behind using the law this way.
And then there's a final, quite pointed assertion at the end.
Yes. The article concludes by stating that if this law, used in this way, sounds like something former President Trump would appreciate. Well, the article's view is that it is.
Okay. We should stress again, that's the specific viewpoint presented in the article we've been analyzing.
Absolutely. We're reporting on the source's perspective here.
So let's pull back. We've gone through the law, the case, the arguments from this source. What's the big takeaway here?
I think it really highlights a fundamental tension, doesn't it? You have this law, Section 111, clearly needed in principle to protect federal officers doing dangerous jobs.
Right.
But then you have this debate spurred by the source article about whether the way it's written, specifically lacking that knowledge requirement, opens the door for it to be used, allegedly, as a tool that could potentially chill dissent, hinder oversight, or unfairly punish people for reacting defensively in confusing situations.
And the stakes feel pretty high. This isn't just legal theory. It touches on really core rights.
Absolutely. Things like self-defense, the right to protest, the ability of elected officials to do their jobs, all balanced against state power, and maybe most fundamentally, your ability to simply know who you are interacting with, especially when force is involved.
It definitely leaves you with something to think about. Consider this. What does it mean for how you navigate public spaces, or even how you think about self-defense, if you could face federal prison for reacting to someone you had no earthly way of knowing was a federal agent?
Yeah, how does that reality, or even just the possibility of it, shape our interactions, our willingness to engage, our understanding of civil liberties versus government authority? It's a deep question.